What happens when a simple flight turns into a public spectacle for Barron Trump? A seemingly ordinary travel day suddenly became a chaotic scene, and no one anticipated the storm that followed once Melania arrived. The loudspeaker crackled as a final boarding call echoed through the busy terminal at Dallas Love Field Airport. Barron Trump sat near gate C-12, his tall frame folded into a chair that seemed a bit too small for him. He kept his head down, scrolling through his phone, trying to blend into the crowd of travelers rushing to catch their flights. At 17, his life was anything but normal, but he had mastered the art of staying low-key in public. Today, though, that effort was about to be tested. A gate agent, an older man with sharp features and an air of impatience, approached the area. His eyes landed on Barron, who was seated in the priority boarding section. There was something about the teenager's calm, almost indifferent demeanor that seemed to rub him the wrong way. "Excuse me, young man," he said, his tone clipped. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" Barron looked up, his expression neutral. "Yes, I am. I have a first-class ticket." His voice was steady and polite, his upbringing clear. The agent scrutinized him for a moment, glancing at Barron's phone, his casual hoodie, and sneakers. "Can I see your ticket?" Barron hesitated. It wasn't the first time he'd been singled out, but something about this man's tone felt different, more aggressive. He handed over his boarding pass, his name clearly displayed on the screen, Barron Trump. The agent read aloud. Pausing, his expression shifted slightly, but instead of backing off, his demeanor hardened. "Wait here." Passengers around them began to take notice, their whispers a low hum of curiosity. Barron felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his expression neutral. Moments later, the agent returned, accompanied by a supervisor. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket," the agent said firmly. "You'll need to step aside while we sort this out." Barron frowned. "What issue? I booked this ticket weeks ago." The supervisor cut in. "We're handling it. Sir, please step away from the gate." As Barron reluctantly moved aside, he could feel the stares of fellow passengers. Some pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. The murmurs grew louder. His frustration simmered, but he bit his tongue, unwilling to make a scene. But the situation wasn't about to calm down. It was escalating quickly. Barron leaned against a nearby column, watching the other passengers board without issue. The glances from the gate staff and whispers from the crowd felt heavier with each passing second. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure of why this was taking so long. Was it his last name, or something else entirely? He wasn't quick to jump to conclusions, but the situation was starting to feel personal. After several minutes, the supervisor returned, his expression still stern. "We're unable to verify your identity through the system. Do you have another form of identification?" Barron furrowed his brow. "My passport is in my carry-on bag. You didn't even check it." The supervisor hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the logical response. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Sir, this isn't just about ID. There are procedures we need to follow." "Procedures?" Barron asked, his tone calm but tinged with disbelief. "What procedures? I've flown through this airport dozens of times without an issue." The gate agent from earlier interjected. "We've had some irregularities lately. You're not being singled out." But the look in his eyes betrayed him. Barron wasn't buying it, and neither were a few passengers nearby who began muttering among themselves. A woman in her late 40s, holding a toddler on her hip, spoke up. "What's the problem? He's just a kid with a ticket. Let him board." The supervisor ignored her, focusing instead on Barron. "You'll need to wait here while we conduct a further review. If you don't comply, we'll have to escalate the matter." "Escalate?" Barron echoed, his patience wearing thin. "What exactly are you escalating? I've done nothing wrong." As if on cue, a pair of airport security officers appeared. Barron's chest tightened, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief at how quickly the situation was spiraling. The officers stood on either side of him, their presence drawing even more attention. "Sir, please come with us," one officer said in a measured tone. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Barron exhaled, his jaw tightening as he grabbed his carry-on bag. "Fine." He followed them into a small, sterile room near the gate, the whispers and camera flashes following him like a storm cloud. Inside, the officers asked him to sit at a table. The air felt colder, heavier as one officer began flipping through his passport. "This is ridiculous," Barron muttered under his breath, shaking his head. One of the officers looked up. "We're just following protocol." "Son," he said, but that word protocol, was starting to sound more like an excuse for something more personal. The more they probed, the more Barron began to feel the weight of an unspoken bias in the room. But what Barron didn't know was that someone else was already on her way, and she wasn't happy. In the back seat of a black SUV weaving through Dallas traffic, Melania Trump sat poised, her phone in hand. She had planned a quick trip to surprise her son at the airport after his flight. But as her phone buzzed with a flood of text messages and social media alerts, her expression shifted from calm to concern. One message caught her attention. Something's going on with Barron at the airport. People are posting videos. Her fingers flew across the screen, pulling up a short clip that showed Barron surrounded by security, being led away from the gate. She replayed it twice, her brow furrowing deeper with each pass. "Driver, please hurry," she said, her voice cool but firm. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Barron sat in the small room, staring at the blank wall in front of him. The officers had stepped out to verify his credentials, leaving him alone to stew in silence. He didn't know who to call or what to do. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping lightly, a rhythm he didn't even realize he was making. Suddenly, the door opened, and the supervisor from earlier walked in. "We're still working on clearing up the situation," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It shouldn't be much longer." "How much longer?" Barron asked, his tone sharp. "You've had all my information for almost an hour." The supervisor hesitated, then mumbled something about procedures again before retreating. Barron exhaled in frustration, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just about a ticket or ID anymore. It felt deeper. Outside the terminal, Melania's SUV pulled up to the curb. She stepped out, her posture commanding despite her understated outfit. Heads turned as she strode through the airport, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She didn't need to announce her presence. People simply moved aside as she passed. Approaching the gate where the incident had occurred, she was met with a flurry of murmurs and whispers. Passengers recognized her instantly, and some even pointed toward the area where security had taken Barron. "Excuse me," she said to a nearby airline employee. "Where is my son?" The employee blinked, stunned by the directness of her question. "Ma'am, let me check." Melania didn't wait for a response. She moved forward, her eyes scanning for any sign of Barron. When she spotted the room where he was being held, her pace quickened. She reached the door just as the two officers returned to Barron. They froze when they saw her, their expressions a mix of surprise and apprehension. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded an answer. "Mrs. Trump," one officer began, fumbling for words. "This is just a standard protocol." "Protocol?" she interrupted, her gaze icy. "You are holding my son in a small room with no explanation. What kind of protocol is this?" The supervisor appeared behind her, his face pale. "Mrs. Trump, this is all just a misunderstanding. We were trying to verify his ticket." "A misunderstanding?" Her voice remained steady, but her tone sharpened. "Do you treat all passengers this way, or just the ones you decide to single out?" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt like time itself had stopped. But this silence wouldn't last for long. Melania was about to demand answers they couldn't provide. Melania's gaze didn't waver as she stood in the doorway. Barron glanced at his mother, his relief visible but restrained. He straightened in his chair, his shoulders no longer slumped. "Mrs. Trump," the supervisor stammered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Please understand. We were just trying to ensure everything was in order." "This isn't in order," Melania interrupted, her tone as sharp as the silence in the room. "You had his ticket, his passport, and his name. What else do you need? A written invitation to board the plane?" The supervisor flinched but tried to recover. We flagged his name in the system, and that required additional checks." "Flagged because he's my son, or because someone decided he didn't belong in first class today?" Melania tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, neither wanting to be the one to respond. The tension was palpable, and everyone in the room felt it. Finally, one of the officers cleared his throat. "It's standard procedure." "Ma'am, we weren't aware of his relation to you until just now," the officer added. Melania's eyes narrowed. "So this is about his last name?" The supervisor opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Save your excuses," she said firmly. "I want to speak to someone in charge now." The man hesitated, but eventually nodded, stepping out of the room to make a call. Melania turned her attention to Barron, her expression softening as she approached him. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Barron nodded, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. Yeah, I'm fine. They've just been wasting my time. Melania gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before turning back to the officers. Let me make something clear, she said, her voice steady and composed. You have humiliated my son in front of dozens of people. This is not about protocol or procedures. This is about respect, or the lack of it. One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Trump, the officer said, we'll make this right. We'll ensure he boards the next flight. You think this is about getting on a flight? She cut in, her voice rising slightly for the first time. This is about accountability. I don't want apologies whispered behind closed doors. I want them where they belong, out there, where this all started. The supervisor, now visibly shaken, led the way back to the boarding gate. Melania walked beside him, her stride measured and unyielding, with Barron following close behind. The tension in the terminal was almost unbearable. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier commotion were still lingering, their curiosity piqued by the sudden return of the teenager and his mother. As they reached the gate, the supervisor stepped forward, cleared his throat, and addressed the crowd. His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, I'd like to take a moment to apologize for a situation that occurred earlier today. A misunderstanding involving one of our passengers, Mr. Barron Trump, led to actions that were unnecessary and inappropriate. A murmur rippled through the crowd, with some passengers exchanging looks of surprise and others nodding in agreement. The supervisor glanced at Melania, whose steady gaze urged him to continue. I want to make it clear, he said, his voice firming up, that this young man did nothing wrong. The incident was entirely due to an error on our part, and for that, we deeply regret the inconvenience and discomfort caused. Barron stood quietly, his hands in his pockets, his expression neutral, but inside, he felt the weight of the moment, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in a public setting. Melania stepped forward, her presence drawing the attention of every person in the gate area. Thank you for your words, she began, her tone measured but resolute. But words are not enough. This is not just about my son. It is about the principle of treating every individual with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from. The room fell silent, her words cutting through the air like a blade. My son may carry a name that draws attention, but he is also a person, a young man who deserves to be treated fairly, as should every passenger in this airport. Let this be a reminder to all of us to pause and think before we act, to remember that respect is not earned by status, but by the humanity we all share. The crowd erupted in applause, some passengers even standing in solidarity. The supervisor lowered his head, his face red with embarrassment. For a moment, the airport buzzed with a newfound energy, not of judgment or division, but of unity. As the applause subsided, a woman with a toddler approached Barron and Melania. I just wanted to say, she said softly, I'm sorry for what you went through. It wasn't right. Melania smiled graciously, her eyes warm. Thank you. That means a lot. Barron nodded, grateful but still processing the whirlwind of events. But this moment of clarity wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a conversation about respect, equality, and accountability that would resonate far beyond the walls of this terminal. As the gate area began to settle, Barron and Melania were escorted to the lounge while waiting for the next flight. The airline staff, now walking on eggshells, went out of their way to ensure their comfort. Offers of refreshments and priority boarding were made, but Melania waved them off politely. For her, this wasn't about compensation. It was about the principle. Barron sat across from her, his hands clasped in his lap. I didn't expect all that, he said quietly, breaking the silence. Melania looked up from her phone, her expression softening. You handled yourself well, she replied. It's not easy to stay calm in moments like that. Barron shrugged. I've dealt with stuff like this before, just not so public. Melania leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. And that's exactly the problem, she said. No one should have to get used to being treated unfairly, whether it's you, me, or someone no one recognizes. Respect should never depend on a last name or appearance. Barron nodded, his mother's words sinking in. You think they'll actually change anything after this? He asked. She tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe not today, but moments like these add up. Change takes time, but it starts with people who stand up and speak out. Barron glanced toward the lounge window where the sunset was beginning to paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. "You've always been one for the long game," he said, a small smile creeping onto his face. Melania smiled back. "Someone has to be." They sat in a comfortable silence, the moment one of understanding, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, there is strength in standing together. As they waited for their rebooked flight, Barron noticed a mix of reactions from people passing through the lounge. Some offered nods of encouragement or shy smiles, while others averted their gaze, unsure of how to respond. Barron's face remained calm, but his mind raced with thoughts about how one misunderstanding had snowballed into a public ordeal. Melania, sitting across from him, appeared unbothered by the glances. She sipped her tea with practiced composure, the same poise she had perfected under the constant glare of public scrutiny. But Barron, still young and unaccustomed to such direct confrontations, felt the weight of the stares more keenly. Breaking the silence, he said, "You know, I didn't think they'd actually apologize. Not like that." Melania set her cup down and leaned slightly forward. "People can surprise you," she replied. "But change takes more than an apology. It takes consistency. We'll see if they've truly learned from this." Barron hesitated, then asked, "Do you think they singled me out because of my name?" Melania didn't answer immediately. She studied him for a moment, her eyes soft but thoughtful. "Your name can open doors," she said finally, "but it can also make people see you as something you're not. Today wasn't just about your name, Barron. It was about assumptions, how people judge based on what they think they know." He nodded slowly, mulling over her words. "It's just frustrating," he admitted. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, and they still treated me like I didn't belong." Melania reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You don't have to justify your place to anyone," she said firmly. "Remember that." Their conversation was interrupted by an airline representative approaching cautiously, her demeanor nervous but polite. "Mrs. Trump, Mr. Trump," she began, "your flight is ready for boarding. We've upgraded you to the most private section of first class, and will ensure a smooth experience for the rest of your journey." Melania stood gracefully, giving the woman a small, polite nod. "Thank you," she said, her tone neutral but professional. She motioned for Barron to follow her. As they walked to the gate, a hush fell over the surrounding passengers. Some whispered among themselves, while others pulled out their phones, snapping quick photos or recording discreetly. Barron tried to block it out, focusing on his mother's steady pace in front of him. When they reached the jet bridge, the same supervisor who had apologized earlier stood waiting, his face a mask of strained politeness. "Mr. Trump, Mrs. Trump, please accept our deepest apologies once again," he said, his words carefully rehearsed. "We've ensured that your flight will be as comfortable as possible." Melania acknowledged him with a curt nod, but her focus was on Barron. She placed a reassuring hand on his back as they boarded the plane. "Come," she said softly, guiding him to their seats. Once settled in the luxurious first-class cabin, Barron exhaled deeply. The ordeal was finally behind them, but he knew the story wouldn't end here. The videos and photos circulating online would spark debates, headlines, and perhaps even more questions. Melania seemed to sense his unease. She leaned over and said quietly, "What happened today will make people talk, but how you respond will define you more than what they say." He looked at her, searching for reassurance. What if they twist it? Make it seem like it wasn't a big deal or blame me somehow? "They might," she admitted, her voice calm. "But you don't need to argue with every critic. Speak the truth when it matters, and let your actions show your character." Barron nodded, absorbing her advice. As the plane taxied down the runway, he glanced out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold against the dark sky. The day had tested him, but he felt stronger knowing he wasn't facing it alone. Melania, seated beside him, rested a hand lightly on his arm. "This is just one moment, Barron," she said softly, "and moments pass. What you do with the lessons they leave behind, that's what matters." He smiled faintly, her words grounding him. The plane lifted off, carrying them away from the chaos of the airport. But the conversation about respect, dignity, and accountability had only just begun, and Barron was determined to be part of it. As the plane climbed higher, leaving the chaotic scene of the airport far below, Barron found his mind circling back to everything that had happened. The gate agent's accusatory tone, the supervisor's evasive explanations, the invasive stares, it was all fresh in his memory. But so too were the words of strangers who had spoken up for him, and the way his mother had commanded the room with her calm yet unwavering presence. Melania had taken out a small notebook and pen from her handbag, jotting something down in neat, deliberate handwriting. Barron glanced at her. Curious. What are you writing? She paused, tapping the pen thoughtfully against her chin. Notes, she replied. Thoughts. Really? About today. About how we can make sure others don't have to go through what you did. Barron leaned back in his seat, intrigued. You think it'll make a difference? Melania looked at him, her expression serious but hopeful. Every small effort counts. Barron, sometimes it takes just one story, one voice, to make others see what they've overlooked. He nodded, then looked out the window again. You're good at that, he said quietly. At what? At making people listen. A faint smile played on her lips. That's not always the case, she admitted. But when you speak from the heart, and when your intentions are clear, people notice. You'll see. They fell into a comfortable silence, the hum of the engines filling the cabin. Barron put on his headphones and queued up a playlist. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the events of the day. He replayed the scene at the gate in his mind, the way the gate agent had scrutinized him, the whispers in the crowd, and the moment he was escorted to the small room. But what stood out most wasn't the humiliation or frustration. It was the woman who had spoken up for him, balancing a toddler on her hip, and the quiet solidarity of strangers who had looked at him with sympathy instead of judgment. Those moments had felt small at the time, but now they seemed significant. Barron pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app. He hesitated for a moment, then began typing, things to remember from today. 1. People will judge you for things you can't control. Don't let it define you. 2. Staying calm doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're stronger than they expect. 3. Sometimes, strangers will surprise you with kindness when you least expect it. 4. Speak up, even if it's uncomfortable. It might make a difference for someone else. He stared at the list for a moment, then added one more. 5. Always stand up for yourself, but never forget to stand up for others. 2. Satisfied. He put his phone away and glanced at his mother. She was still writing, her expression focused. He wondered if she was planning her next move, an op-ed, perhaps, or a meeting with airport officials to push for policy changes. Mom, he said after a moment. She looked up. Yes? Thanks. For everything today. Her expression softened. You don't need to thank me, Barron. It's my job to protect you. I know, he said, but still, I'm glad you were there. Melania reached over and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. I'll always be here, she said simply. As the plane continued its journey, Barron felt a quiet determination settle over him. The day had been challenging, but it had also been eye-opening. He didn't know exactly how, but he knew he wanted to use his voice, his experiences, to make a difference. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. For now, though, he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the steady rhythm of the plane carry him forward. As the plane soared through the clouds, the tension of the day slowly melted away, replaced by a reflective calm. Barron watched the world pass by beneath him, a patchwork of towns and cities, rivers winding like silver threads. Each moment felt lighter, as if the distance from the airport was helping him leave the way. Melania set her notebook aside and looked at her son. You know, she said, breaking the silence. What happened today wasn't just about you. Barron turned to her. Curious. What a yo. I mean that this kind of treatment happens to people all the time. People without a recognizable last name or someone to back them up. They face assumptions, biases, and disrespect simply because they're different, or because someone feels they don't belong. Barron nodded slowly. So what do we do? Melania smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and resolve in her expression. We shine a light on it. We hold people accountable. Yes, but more importantly, we remind the world that everyone deserves respect, not just in airports or public spaces. Barron thought about that. Do you think people will actually care? Or will it just blow over? Like everything else, oh. Melania leaned back in her seat, considering his question. Some might forget, she admitted, but others won't. The ones who've experienced it themselves, the ones who see the bigger picture, they'll remember. And sometimes, all it takes is planning. The plane began its descent, the captain announcing their imminent arrival. As the city lights below grew brighter, Barron felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day's events hadn't just been an ordeal, they had been a lesson. When the plane landed and they disembarked, the atmosphere was calmer. The airline staff, now overly attentive, greeted them with polite smiles and reassurances that the earlier incident would be thoroughly reviewed. Melania accepted their words graciously, though her eyes hinted at skepticism. In the car ride to their destination, Barron scrolled through his phone, noticing the growing online discussion sparked by his mother's post. The comments were a mix of opinions, some empathetic, others critical, but the majority seemed to agree on one point: respect and fairness should be universal. He turned the screen off and looked at his mother. "Do you think things will actually change?" "They can," she replied, "but only if people like you and me keep pushing for it. Change doesn't happen overnight, Barron. It happens in moments, moments like today." Barron nodded, letting her words sink in. Maybe he couldn't change the world right away, but he could start by being mindful of how he treated others and speaking out when he saw injustice. That, he realized, was a small but powerful way to make a difference. As they pulled into the driveway of their destination, Barron stepped out of the car and stretched. The fresh air a welcome contrast to the confined spaces of the day. Melania placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet gesture of reassurance. "Today was hard," she said, her voice gentle, "but you handled it with grace. I'm proud of you." Barron gave her a small smile. "Thanks, Mom. I learned a lot today." She nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and pride. "We both did." As they walked inside, the world felt a little bigger and a little more complex. But Barron carried with him a newfound understanding that respect, fairness, and accountability weren't just ideas, they were responsibilities. And sometimes, it took a difficult moment to see that clearly. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew this: he wouldn't let the day's lesson go to waste. Change started small, with one voice, one act of kindness, one stand for what was right, and he was ready to be a part of that change. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own faith and share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.